to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to Safe Inside, podcast brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Sandy.
And today we're going to talk about how trauma is not a lifelong sentence.
I think that a lot of people who have experienced trauma, especially complex childhood trauma, believe that there's no way to get through the other side. You know, it's hard to even imagine what a healthy life would look like if trauma had not happened. And so many clients come to us believing that the most that we can do is just help them sort of manage their symptoms or their responses, really, and that's the best that they can hope for. And yet we know that there is actually healing from trauma, and it doesn't have to be this lifelong sentence of living miserably. You can actually engage in life and live fully. So that's really kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a big one. Because, it's one thing for somebody to have walked it out and found their own healing, but it's a whole process just trying to get somebody to find their own buy-in to believe it can be true for them too.
Right. And part of that healing process is creating a mindset, at least being able to imagine yourself walking in that wholeness, being able to see yourself operating as a healthy person once these psychological wounds are healed. And so, part of treatment is helping clients develop the hope for that different future and helping them visualize what that might look like. And so it's hard for clients, if you think about the effect of trauma, you think about how trauma impacts the neurobiology, which we've talked about in previous episodes. But if we think about all of the things that it does, if we are in a fight or flight state most of the time, we've spent most of our life in survival mode. And so even our physiology, our adrenaline, our cortisol, all of those things stay overactive. And after a while, they do some work on our organs. It's only logical. And then, if we spend most of our life in that state, then our muscles may tense up, we may armor. Those are some physical changes, along with many others that we've talked about. But there's also emotional changes. You learn, if you grow up being traumatized by one or more people, you grow up learning that the world is not a safe place and that maybe your experience is not valid. And so you don't learn to trust your own experiences or your own thoughts, your own intuition. Trusting your gut is not something that trauma survivors do very well, even though many times their gut might be right, but they've learned not to trust that. They've learned to suppress that. If you grow up thinking that, life is pain, to quote a famous movie, right, Princess Bride, life is pain, Highness. But, if you grow up believing that, then you don't look for those experiences, and you might not even recognize those experiences that are not painful, that might even actually be joyful. And on top of that, if you've experienced that much trauma, we know that trauma survivors typically have a very small, limited tolerance for emotions. And so their happiness that they may feel is very limited. It's like on a spectrum. And so that range of emotions is shortened tremendously. And so how do we push that out so that someone could truly enjoy life and truly take part in life wholly? On top of all of that, as complex trauma, the treatment is also complex. We also have to consider that most people that have been through trauma as children have fractured in some way. We have our parts, depending on how much they fractured. We have these dissociative parts, but then we have all these other parts of us that may not be wholly integrated or integrated at all. And so how do we pull all of that together in a way that means that we can move healthily and wholly into life and then enjoy life and experience it? That's the picture that somehow it, as a therapist, somehow I have to convey that picture to clients because it is possible.
In the last couple of years, since for maybe the first time in history, we can say we sort of all experienced one thing together.
Yes.
Quarantine has become a very familiar term for keeping a bad situation from getting even worse. Is that a useful bit of imagery for what happens when we fracture?
I think so. I think it is. I think quarantine that we all went through in our area, it was about a year long quarantine. And it taught us a lot of things. It was a joint trauma, actually, across the world. At the same time, there were so many other things going on. There were the wildfires in Australia. There were, riots and killings and protests and political turmoil. And all of that was just the United States, not including the other countries. And all of that was all at the same time.
Seemed like
Wow.
anything that could explode did.
Yeah, and it seems like it's still kind of 2 years later, still kind of not settled all the way down. But there were things in quarantine that many of us were told we could do to help make quarantine easier, or we could change our perspective on it, and it might also change how we felt about it and how we responded to it overall. For instance, I saw a meme that went around social media quite a bit during the first days of quarantine, and it's not stuck at home, we are safe at home. And it was a way of trying to reframe it to help people come out on the other side a bit more psychologically healthy. And it's around that reframing that we haven't done so well as a society around quarantine, but we also haven't done as well around regular trauma, right? Or complex childhood trauma, because really that is normal trauma. The quarantine is normal trauma. It was just an unusual event in our lifetimes, I guess.
Another form of isolation.
It is another form of isolation, which, by the way, is typically a trauma response. If you've been violated, you are not going to be around a lot of people. You're going to learn that it's not safe, nor do you have the skills to be able to relate interpersonally. So it puts all of these things in a client who grows up with trauma. All of a sudden they're like, well, what does life look like for me after this? So what does life look like for us after quarantine or after COVID?
And if that's looked on a personal traumatic level, if that's looked like you quarantining off a part of yourself so that it doesn't make the rest of yourself even worse, that can be quite an intimidating thing to even navigate.
Yeah, it can be that they can quarantine for that, or just that they may be unacceptable, or it's a way of just dissociating from different parts of their trauma to stay sort of functional and stable. There are a lot of reasons that people sort of fracture throughout. There are particular therapies that work with that, like the internal family systems therapy, that work with that directly. But there are other ones too, and there are other names for different ways that we do that. But everybody that experiences trauma as a child is going to have some pieces that are not integrated wholly. And on top of that, they may not know who they are through that whole process, which is probably another episode, I guess.
And I think that deserves to be an episode, because that's quite a stabilizing factor, isn't it? If you can say, well, I at least know who I am.
Mm-hmm. And there's no real cohesion to people that have experienced trauma. Trauma itself becomes that cohesion or their identity. It is, I am a trauma survivor, so if we say I'm a thriver and I'm healed from that, what does that even look like? Who are they? How are they going to function in this world? And really the biggest question that most clients have for me is this possible? Is the best that I can do doing some mindfulness to keep from crying all the time? Is the best that I can do, working on my suicidal ideation? Is the best I can do, being with my kids present, but maybe not fully engaging or being available to them.
Like you're saying this, and I'm seeing in my mind. You see this in cartoons sometimes. The canoe that's just maybe 10 feet from the edge of the waterfall is the best I can do. Is just keep paddling.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty much it, and they feel kind of stuck there. And
At best.
at best, if they're not being pulled over the cliff or the waterfall, I guess, to pull that on. And yeah, the thing is, we know that people can be healed. Trauma is a psychological injury. It is not a mental illness. And I have many clients who come and go, I have mental illness, I have trauma. Well, once we sit and go through everything, and I'm like, your diagnosis, I'm not seeing a mental illness. I'm just seeing a psychological injury. And I explain to them that it is an injury to their psychology, to their emotions, to their core of being who they are, just like if they had been beaten and taken to an emergency room, or they had broken their leg or were in a car accident and broken their leg, going to the hospital, and if they had to have some surgery to get it fixed or whatever, after a while it would heal. It might leave a scar, but it would heal.
Whereas it's like that's an injury. Whereas if it were a disorder or an illness, that would be like your body not cooperating with healing when it's given the opportunity to do so.
Right, there's a difference between a car accident, breaking your leg, and having cancer. And that's the difference between mental illness and trauma. Trauma is literally a psychological injury. And so if it's a psychological injury, that means then that we can heal. We can work on this and do what needs to happen, do our surgery, do our bandaging, do our physical therapies, so to speak, to carry that analogy, and come out on the other side. Now, there may be scars, and I have fell down at Thanksgiving, down the steps at church, don't tell anyone, and scraped my entire shin. And then I also got bruised under my chin very badly. Fortunately, I was wearing a thick mask on top of another mask, and it protected it, but it was this huge bruise. Everywhere we went, my poor husband, if I took my mask off, people looked at him like he had hit me, and I promised it was not him, and I had witnesses. But I had that bruise, and that healed really nicely. However, as I went down the steps, it tore my pants, and the concrete steps scraped my shin. So it healed, it doesn't hurt, I can touch it, it's fine. However, now I have this nice long white scar down my leg. It was at Thanksgiving just a few months ago. So I don't know how long that scar is going to stay or how big it's going to stay. I don't know right now. But to be perfectly honest, I rarely notice it unless I'm shaving my legs or something. I don't pay that much attention. I guess I probably should, but I don't. It's there, but I'm healed from that.
It'll always be part of your story, but it's not part of your present reality.
Right. It's like, oh yeah, that happened back at Thanksgiving, and isn't that funny how I fell down the steps? I guess I make jokes of it, which is another like
Yeah, funny to you
coping
maybe.
skills. Yeah, it wasn't funny at the time. I was more embarrassed than anything, that's kind of funny in itself. But anyway, so I have this scar, and it's not impacting my life at all. I'm not one that worries too much about my appearance, so I don't think about it when I put on a dress or something. It's like, it is what it is, and so it's not a huge deal in my life. But it does exist because of an injury that I got. Trauma's the same way. So you can experience trauma, you can be through that, and it can leave scars and change kind of how you are to some degree. But through treatment, at the end of that, you can come out with the scars and not actively bleeding, which is a huge improvement.
Yeah. Would you say that process begins with helping a person connect to hope, or are there preliminary steps before that?
Well, I think that as a therapist, I always start with hope. They don't always connect right away, but I start the treatment with that expectation that we are going to come out on the other end. And it's not me just pulling the pie in the sky kind of, well, I'm hoping this happens. I've seen it happen many, many times. And so one of the first things I do with clients, besides praise them for showing up for the treatment, which takes so much courage, it always inspires me with the courage that people have. The
Especially
bravery.
when they don't realize just how big of a first step that is.
I know, but they do it anyway. They kind of do it blindly. And so I certainly want to recognize and honor that with them. But then the next thing I do is talk to them about what expectations of healing might be, what it might look like on the other side. And at first, most clients, they hear me talking about healing and they hear me talking about hope. And what they picture is, okay, I'll be able to go to my son's ball games without having a panic attack. And if at first that's all they can imagine, then I buy into that with the client. And I'm like, okay, let's work towards that. When they get to that point and they're able to actually go to that ball game without a panic attack, then in therapy, we'll talk about that and say, okay, just like this happened and you had a hard time imagining that, think about this bigger thing happening. And so it gives them framework then to start putting that hope on, because many of them have not even had a framework for hope in their life. And so it's a way of kind of stepping them through to gain that vision of what it may look like if they get on the other side.
And that echoes the common thing you'll see with depression, where it sort of eclipses a sense of possibilities, which is another way of losing your capacity for having vision. And doesn't, to take kind of an Adlerian look, isn't vision kind of what pulls us toward anything that we have to reach for?
Absolutely, it is. And the thing that we also, or one of the many things that we know about trauma survivors, is that envisioning a future is not common. Typically, they don't envision a future very well. If you've worked with people with complex trauma, you ask them what do they want to do with their life, whatever, and it's always extremely vague. It's because they don't really have that forward looking. Because trauma, until it's healed, keeps us backwards looking. And it messes with our sense of future. It's almost as if we believe that we don't have a future, because sooner or later, something's going to kill me. I mean, it kind of boils down to that. Even if we don't vocalize that or to ourselves, it's just, the future's just not going to happen for me. And so that hope is hard to instill, because part of that is helping clients envision an actual future, that they are going to live through this and get to the other side.
I'm going to introduce as just a very simple analogy in case anybody listening, maybe you don't resonate with this in your own experience. Maybe you can't say, now I think I've been traumatized now that you're putting this into words. But maybe you'd like to understand, for the sake of those in your life who have experienced trauma, and maybe it's hard for you to kind of connect to that. Well, let me just throw out there so that you can consider it through this lens. Remember when you were first learning language and you were learning your ABCs? And once you gained mastery over that, you started learning how to write. You started learning how to write words correctly. Pretty soon you got good enough at it that you weren't writing your letters backwards. And now, I'm going to guess most of you can write a sentence, or at least read a sentence, without having to sound out each letter. So now imagine, through that process of frequent repetition, it becomes so automatic that you don't have to question it, because you don't have to sound it out. The frequency and the constant repetition, because even if you're not reading books all the time, you're reading cereal boxes, you're reading billboards, you're reading whatever it is you have to read, the notifications on your phone or your computer, there is so much review that this becomes a truly automatic brain process. So imagine if something traumatic happened to you, or happened to a friend of yours, and you're thinking, well, why can't you just decide to think differently? Well, imagine rehearsing this truly continuously, and you start to get a better sense of how difficult it could be to turn the tide.
Yeah, and keep in mind too that all that you said is true, and trauma also rewires the brain. And so trauma treatment works to sort of unwire it from one way and rewire those neuronic pathways a different way. And so saying something to someone, why don't you just get over it, basically says, why don't you just rewire your brain right there in the moment, learn another language, and have a vision for the future. And if you put it that way, it's like, oh, well, I guess that's not really possible in the moment. And it's a little unfair, or more than a little unfair, to expect that from trauma survivors. And you know, if you grow up with trauma, you have carried all of that trauma always. And it takes a lot of capacity to carry this trauma. And so many trauma survivors may not remember much of school. They may not remember many of life skills because they don't have the capacity to carry that. They may not be able to, even if they hadn't dissociated, for instance, in math class, they may not have learned their multiplication tables because they did not have the capacity to focus on that. And so saying to someone, just feel better, you're really asking them to pretend as if everything was fine and somehow pick up all of the things that they don't know immediately and integrate them into their lives. And that's not possible, nor is it fair or compassionate to trauma survivors.
That sheds a little light on how important it is to not undertake this process alone.
It really is. Therapists are trained to help step through this with you and to kind of help guide. You still have to do the work, of course, but therapists can guide and direct and help kind of support, encourage throughout as well. Sometimes just knowing what's happening and sometimes having someone who can hold your hope for you. I use that analogy a lot with my clients. I will say to them, I know you don't have hope for this, but I have seen it happen so many times. And so I hold your hope for you, and it's right here when you're ready to pick it up. I use that statement quite a bit, and I use my hands to hold the hope to show them that here it is, and when you're ready. And there have been times where when I see them picking that hope up, I'll say, do you remember way back when I said I was holding your hope for you? I see you now reaching over and taking it yourself. And I honor that moment because it's a special moment with clients when they do that. So, yeah.
That is. And that's what a thing to be able to speak with authority on that, because people, even if they can't put it into words, they recognize that on a deep level when they know somebody's not just putting one over on them.
Yes, yes. And as we're talking about, there's life after trauma. You know, trauma is not a lifelong sentence. When you're looking for that help to get to the other side, you do need someone who's very authentic. You do need a therapist who is not just faking it till they make it. You need someone who's genuine with you, because the whole thing about trauma takes you away from being your authentic self. It violates your personhood in such a way that being authentic can feel unsafe. And so you learn not to be authentic. And so the one thing that you really need, well, one of the many things, but one important thing that you need to get to the other side of trauma is someone to model for you true authenticity. My clients know that I am who I am. I don't get any better, I don't get any worse, so I guess it balances out. They laugh because I tell them I see too many clients to have enough energy to be anything more than I present, which is good, I guess, and bad, supposedly, but you have to have that authenticity. And you're right, when I say to clients, I have your hope here, if I have any tinge of doubt in that, if I'm lying in any way to myself and or to them, they're going to know it, because one thing that trauma survivors have, and that is they can tell usually if a person is lying or not. They may not trust their gut, but they'll know something's off with that person. They become very sensitive to inauthenticity. And so
yeah, I'm gonna plug this real quick. So if you've seen that in yourself and viewed it as a weakness, take a moment to recognize that it's a strength you have.
It's a superhero strength. Yeah, yeah, it's a super strength. You know, that's as we're talking about that and thinking about trauma, it's not a lifelong sentence. There are some trauma responses that present with particular patterns, which a lot of people feel very hopeless around. For instance, borderline personality disorder, and there's some discussion of moving it in the DSM versions from a personality disorder to a trauma response, which is someone who's worked in trauma for many years, I think would be a wise move, and more, it would be more reflective of really what this disorder is. But with borderline personality, one of the things is people with that tend to be highly sensitive to other people's thoughts and feelings in authenticity or authenticity. And they react very strongly to that. They have trouble regulating their emotional affect, which is part of the whole presentation. But it's always presented as if this is a bad thing. And really, that being overly sensitive is actually, like you said, it's a strength. It is a survival skill.
It may be when you haven't gotten any training to temper.
I think so. And I think that as a society, you know, I would love to see us as a society move to more compassion and empathy around what trauma responses can show, how they can show up and what they look like, and having more empathy for the people who are experiencing this. But I would also like for people who have experienced trauma to know that whether or not society moves there as fast as we need it to, I do see some movement, but whether or not it moves there as fast as we need it to, they don't have to stay. They don't have to wait for that. They can do their own work and come out on the other side, and life can be good. It may not be, you know, some kind of movie, Hallmark movie picture perfect, because we do have those scars, but we can
I'm
have,
just as well with it not looking like a Hallmark
well,
movie.
that's true. I don't really watch those, but we have role reversal in my house. My husband likes those.
Oh, okay.
I like the action movies, so there is that. I guess because I can take the action, but then the Hallmark movie feels very inauthentic and contrived to me. But
I get no comfort from a storyline being designed to be predictable.
yeah, right. That's yeah. I think that's why I like counseling, to be honest, because everyone feels like their stories are so rich and deep and complex, and I love listening to people's stories. I love listening to people's stories. And
It's
I never
real
ever
life.
get tired of that. Yeah, it's real life, and I never get tired of it. So, but anyway, back to, and if you like Hallmark movies, no judgment.
Yeah, no
on
judgment
that.
there.
Yeah, it's just not.
We don't meet with our clients for movie night anyway.
No judgment, but I watch other things. So anyway, back to not being a lifelong sentence. You know, it's more than just getting paroled, right? When you get paroled, you have to, you leave, but you're always someone who's been in prison, and then you have all of this on your record. You can get to a place with trauma where you can sort of break out of that prison, but in a way where it doesn't matter. It's totally a done deal. And I don't want to use the word pardon, because there's nothing that you've done to need a pardon. Exonerated, maybe, would be a good word.
I suppose freed is a word.
Freed, right. And that exoneration for me and that freedom also means freedom from shame. You know, almost all trauma victims feel shame. And as they move from victim to survivor to thriver, they learn that that's not their shame. You know, that doesn't belong to them. They've taken on their abuser's shame so that abuser doesn't have to carry it, but that's not theirs to carry, nor should they. And so getting to that other side where they can walk out of that sort of trauma response prison, to keep that analogy going, they can leave all of that behind and step into life feeling good about themselves.
It makes me think of, you know, we have seen people try to take some steps to be mindful of the language they use when it comes to, instead of calling someone a borderline,
Right.
referring to their personhood first.
Right.
And that's good. But the thing that I think is hard, because I tend to think that this is pretty automatic, is when a person is given like a personality disorder diagnosis. Not only do they take in the meaning that, oh, this is what's wrong with me, but I think often enough they also implicitly take the meaning and it's permanent.
Yes, yes. And when we're talking about something like specifically borderline personality disorder, as it is viewed in our society, it is viewed almost as a character flaw, and it's your personality that, so your trauma response becomes considered your personality, and therefore it is your problem and your fault. There is something wrong with who you are, is what we're implying when we attribute that trauma response to a personality disorder. And so at that point, that's saying, like you said, there is no recovery from that because this is who I am as a person. All I can do, the best I can do, is manage it.
And if you compound that with already not really knowing yourself as a person.
Right, right. It's a very inhumane way to view and treat trauma survivors. And it does more harm than good. And many people, if you say, oh, I've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, people are like, I don't want to deal with you because you have a reputation for being overly sensitive or having trouble regulating your emotions or, all of these things. Well, yeah, they're bleeding from their psychological injury. It, that's what's going on. They're bleeding.
Yeah.
So, but they don't have to bleed forever. If other personality disorders, they're typically not caused by trauma so much. There's some discussion around histrionic at this point, but they become patterns of personality, where with things like borderline personality disorder, if you go down the list and look at the etiology, it's almost always built around abuse and attachment problems as children. And so I'm not quite sure how we ended up putting that on the victim of the trauma, but somehow our society has done that. And I think in a smaller way, they have done that with other complex trauma survivors. They have done that. It's kind of like, well, just pick yourself up. Well, I would if I could,
So this may sound neither here nor there, but hear me out with this, because I'm going to introduce this briefly, and maybe this will be worth returning to in greater depth another time. But if something that affected your personality and how you show up in the world happened as a direct cause of abuse, then that means that happened in relationship. And if it happened in relationship, then let's step back for just a moment and consider that you do act a little differently around different friends, not because you're not being authentic around certain friends, but because different things resonate with different people that you spend time with. So, just for the sake of entertaining the notion, consider that if you can find healing from something that happened through abuse, you no longer have to have so much of your personage tied to that relationship and the way that one relationship affected you and set the limits for how you can show up in the world. So if you see something that seemingly has affected all of who you are as a person, consider just how much your environment, just how much your circle of friends has made you show up a little differently throughout different chapters of your life so far already. And that by itself could be a reason to hope for the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What else should we get? I feel like this is a topic we could go on for 3 hours, but I know that this is already getting to be a bit of a long episode.
Right.
What should we cover before we wrap this one up?
Well, I think the only thing left is to say, honestly, if you are listening or watching and you feel like you have experienced trauma and you're not sure that happy ending, so to speak, is for you, the answer is, of course it is. Of course it is. You just get a good therapist and do the work. It's not easy work and it's not fast work, but it definitely is doable and worthwhile because, we were having lunch earlier and I was saying it's a pretty day outside if you can see behind us if you're looking. And I was saying, I don't like to miss any pretty days. I plan to live a lot longer than I do now, but I want every one of those days because I enjoy them. I want them. And, life can be that way after trauma. You just have to do the work. So, yeah, have some hope. And if you don't have it, contact us. We'll hold your hope for you.
Yeah, yeah. Whether it's us or whether it's friends or both, and honestly, I'd recommend both. Not just because I get paid if it's both, but because you have to. You don't need me to tell you this. You already know how hard it is. If it's hard for you to hold your own hope, it's hard for you to be the voice that you need to hear. Things have to be sustained. Things have to be maintained. And if you're in a place that by now it's just unsustainable, things are not at a trajectory to get better if things stay the way they are, then if this has been, I'll say it this way, if this has been a moment of clarity for you, act on it while it's clear to you.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us this week. Next episode, we're going to start talking about the healing process and what it looks like to begin creating a structure as you pursue that journey. Talk to you soon.